All right, we're going to take a look now at the first part of Ezra-Nehemiah, the three return and rebuild cycles. And we're going to take a look at each element of this pattern in turn. So first, God using a Persian king to commission Israel's return and rebuilding. Now, this is going to emphasize God's providence, his control of what's going on, the activity in Ezra-Nehemiah. He's the one who's going to stir the heart of Cyrus. And then he's going to stir the heart of Artaxerxes. And then God is the one who's going to place Nehemiah specifically as the cupbearer to the king, just like he placed Joseph in Egypt and he placed Daniel in Babylon before Nebuchadnezzar, and then Esther, and then Mordecai. God placed these specific people here as a testament to the fact that he is on the move and that he is blessing his people, and he intends to do so. Second element of the pattern, new Exodus. Now, what we mean by this is that the authors are going to characterize Israel's return to the land using the same concepts, ideas, and even language that was used of Israel's exodus out of Egypt. Now, when I say language, I'm referring specifically to Ezra 1, verse 11, where it says that Israel was brought up out of Babylon. And the word that's used there is Allah. This is the Hebrew word Allah, or to bring up out of. And this phrase, to bring up out of Egypt, is used dozens of times in the Old Testament. So clearly there's a linking between the first Exodus and the second Exodus. Now, other examples of new Exodus imagery here in this first section. Well, the first thing that Israel does when they get back to the land is they offer a free will offering to build the temple. And that's the first thing that the Israelites did when they're in the wilderness, is offer a free will offering in order to build, in their case, the tabernacle. And do you remember what the last thing Israel did before they left Egypt? In Exodus 12 and 13, they celebrate the Passover. Well, so the last thing in this section in Ezra chapter 6 is another celebration of the Passover. See these parallels? They're happening left and right. What about the second section? How is the rebuilding of the Torah under Ezra, how does that repeat some of these Exodus ideas? Well, Ezra, he times the departure to be on the exact same day as when Israel left Egypt, the first day of the first month. That's the exact day that they left Babylon under Ezra. And then he goes to great lengths to make sure that he has enough Levites in order to carry the temple vessels back to the promised land, recreating the wilderness journey where Levites are going to carry the equipment for the tabernacle. He's recreating that experience here. Finally, what about Nehemiah? What's his contribution to this new Exodus idea? Well, kind of like Ezra acts as a new Moses, so Nehemiah is going to act as a new Joshua. He's going to be our new Joshua. And take a look at some of the comparisons between Nehemiah 1 to 7 and what we see in the book of Joshua. Well, first off, Nehemiah in chapter 2, he's going to spy out the city, right? He goes on this secret journey on horseback, and he's spying out the city to see the condition of the walls. Well, Joshua is going to send spies into the city of Jericho. And then when they are working on the walls, Nehemiah is going to give the stirring call, and he's going to say, God will fight for us. And this phrase, God will fight for us, is a favorite phrase of Joshua. He's going to use it 4 times in that book. And you remember at the dedication of the walls in chapter 12, Nehemiah is going to have people walk all around the walls in a big circle blowing trumpets. Now, does that sound familiar to you from the book of Joshua? Did people go around the walls of a city blowing trumpets? Yeah, it's like a conscious reversal of that episode. As soon as the walls came up, they went around it and blew trumpets. But with Joshua, they went around the walls and blew trumpets, and the walls came down. So what's the point of this new Exodus imagery we have in Ezra-Nehemiah? Well, it's designed, these parallels are designed to instill expectation. So in the same way that the first Exodus was the birth of a nation, the birth of the nation of Israel, so this second Exodus is intended to be the rebirth of the nation. Prophecy is being fulfilled, and we have this sense that the kingdom is coming. It's a very optimistic section of the book. And then we have this next element, our third element of the story, the opposition that each of these leaders will face in their rebuilding efforts. So we know earlier that when the Israelites returned to the land, they began to rebuild the temple, but then they faced opposition, and there was a 16-year delay. And this delay is overcome thanks to the preaching ministry of Haggai and Zechariah, and then just a ton of letters that just get thrown back and forth in these chapters. It's kind of funny, actually. There's a lot of official correspondence that's recorded for us here in Ezra 1 to 6. But the key takeaway actually is in one of the last verses of chapter 6. Take a look. So in Ezra 6, say 22, so the temple has been completed and there's joy with the people, for it says that Yahweh was the one who made them joyful, and Yahweh turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them. This completion of the temple happened because Yahweh made it happen. And that's what I'm trying to depict right here. Pay attention to how many times the story is going to say that the hand of the Lord was on them, and that's why they were given success. So first in Ezra 6:22, the hand of Yahweh was enabling the success of the Israelites to rebuild the temple. Now, what's the opposition that Ezra is going to face with the rebuilding of the Torah? Well, it is this intermarriage conflict where Jews are going to be marrying non-Jews. Let's take a look at just that episode. So Ezra 9:1. The people of Israel and the priests have not separated themselves from the peoples of their land, but have taken some of their daughters to be their wives. So this is addressed in chapter 9, and there's this stirring prayer of repentance, but the solution that Ezra comes up with in chapter 10 is a little questionable, and we're going to get to that in a second. So what about the opposition of Nehemiah to the rebuilding of the walls? Well, honestly, these chapters are super exciting to read. Nehemiah's leadership really shines here. After his inspection of the walls, he divides the people to build different sections of the wall, and then when opposition comes, he has them hold a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other hand, and to defend against the opposition that's assailing them. And it's really quite exciting, but the conclusion, the big takeaway, is really the same as with the completion of the temple. This time we're in Nehemiah 6:16. And again, we're going to see that it's God's hand that resulted in the completion of the temple. Take a look. Nehemiah 6:16. Here we are. The wall is finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul. And when the enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid. Why? Because they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. God is the one that brought this work into completion. He's the one who's active. And that's really what this whole section is displaying. And next, we're going to take a look at the anticlimax to each of these stories. All right, now for the last part of this cycle, the anticlimax. One dictionary defines an anticlimax as a disappointing end to an exciting or impressive series of events. And there's definitely been some excitement so far in Ezra-Nehemiah, but there's about to be some disappointment. This disappointment, this anticlimax, is hinted at in this first section, the rebuilding of the temple, in Ezra 3, 12, and 13, where it depicts the joy of the people, but then it also depicts their weeping. Take a look at that verse. So Ezra 3:12. Ezra 3:12. So when the foundation had been laid, many of the old men who had seen the first house, that is the Temple of Solomon, they wept with a loud voice. Now, why do you think they would weep? Because they're comparing it to Solomon's temple, and they're like, this is nothing like Solomon's temple. Many people shouted for joy, and the people could not distinguish then between the sound of the joyful shout and the sound of the people's weeping. So what's going on inside of their head is, all right, God has promised in the prophets that he's going to restore the glory of Solomon's kingdom to Israel. Well, if he's going to do that, shouldn't our temple at least resemble Solomon's temple? So there's this disappointment that's ringing in the ears of this older generation. But it runs even deeper than that. What happened after the tabernacle was completed in Exodus 40, and when Solomon's temple was completed in 1 Kings 8, God's presence filled the temple. Remember that? Here's God's Holy Spirit present. It's going to fill the temple. Now, when the temple is completed in Ezra 6, do we hear any mention of God's Spirit filling the second temple? No, we don't. It's missing. Now, that's extremely troubling, and it's confirmed for us in the book of Malachi. Now, you remember Malachi is going to preach after the construction of the second temple. Look at Malachi chapter 3. Malachi 3. And it's going to promise, I'm going to send my messenger. He will prepare the way for me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Now, this means that the Lord, he hasn't come to the temple yet. And that's the situation for the post-exiles. Okay, so what is the anticlimax then for the second section, Ezra and the rebuilding of the Torah? Well, honestly, this section is just littered with questions, with Israel's intermarriage with the Gentile peoples around them and the way that they deal with that problem. So let's take a look at just how the story is introduced in Ezra 9. Ezra 9. So we already saw the people have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land, and their solution comes in chapter 10, where it says that let's make a covenant to put away all these wives and their children. Their solution is mass divorce. Divorce your wives, send them away, send away your children. I mean, really, it's not a pretty situation, and it brings up a whole series of questions. I mean, firstly, was it wrong for the Israelites to intermarry with the people around them? Well, Deuteronomy 7 certainly makes it sound like it was the wrong thing to do. Here in verse 3, it says, "You shall not intermarry with them, or give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons." But the thing is, I mean, this was preached by Moses 600 years ago in a completely different situation. And these people groups, the Hittites, the Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, they no longer exist. So that kind of throws a wrench in things. And then also, when you consider that many of the other Old Testament heroes of the faith, they had foreign wives as well. Take a look at this laundry list here. Abraham married an Egyptian. Joseph married an Egyptian. Moses married a Midianite. We know Rahab, a Canaanite, she was integrated even into the genealogy of Jesus. So was Ruth, who was a Midianite. David, we see, married a Geshurite. So clearly, it's not as simple as it sounds. Jason DeRoshi, Old Testament biblical studies professor, he has said that the Bible celebrates inter-race marriage, but it detests interfaith marriage. I think the next question we have to ask then is, okay, well, these marriages that took place in Ezra 9, are they interfaith marriages or just simply interrace marriages? Well, the text isn't completely clear on this point. Take a look again at Ezra 9, where it says that the people of the land have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land with their abominations. So maybe these people practice abominations, and that seems a little bit more clear in verse 14, where in the prayer it says, "Shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who practice these abominations?" So maybe these are foreign god worshippers that they're marrying. But even still, I mean, the next question is divorce the right answer? I mean, we know that God, he hates divorce. He forbids divorce. And that brings up this distinction then between descriptive events and prescriptive events. Now, we notice, if you read carefully, God never commands Ezra to take this step. He just takes it himself. And then if we compare it to what the New Testament teaches about divorce, things get even more complicated. 1 Corinthians 7:12, it says that if any brother has a wife who was an unbeliever, the exact same situation we have in Ezra 9, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Well, that's strange, because Ezra said, y'all should get divorced with your unbelieving spouse. And then there's this other element, which is kind of confusing. Take a look now again at Ezra 9, Ezra 10. Let's skip ahead to chapter 10. When this divorce proceeding takes place, it says that all the people sat in the open square before the house of God, and they were trembling. And why were they trembling? Because of the heavy rain. There was heavy rain that was drenching them. And that's super weird. It's going to repeat it again. The people were many, and this is a time of heavy rain, and we cannot stand in the open. All right, so here's our poor little guy. He's shivering. He needs some rain clouds above him. So let's give him a little bit of rain clouds, more rain clouds, and they're just raining all over his parade here. And this is strange, because biblical narrative almost never is going to describe the setting. You know, when do you read in the Bible, it was a sunny day, the birds were chirping, and the warmth of the rays of sun tickled his arms? Like, it doesn't describe that. That's not the way that biblical narrative is written. It doesn't describe rainy days, except here in Ezra chapter 10. And that's going to force us to ask more questions. Why is it describing this heavy rain that makes the people tremble? Is it because God is it a sign of his disapproval of these foreign marriages? Or is it a sign of disapproval of the way that they're responding to these foreign marriages by divorcing their family? Honestly, these are murky waters here, and an obvious anticlimax. The anticlimax for Nehemiah is going to take place in chapter 5. And chapter 5 is really super odd. I mean, you can be reading through Nehemiah, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can jump right over chapter 5 and continue reading in chapter 6, and the story doesn't skip a beat. You could cut chapter 5 out, and it would be as if it never needed to exist. What's happening in chapter 5? Let's take a look. Nehemiah chapter 5. So, in Nehemiah 5, the poor Israelites, they're struggling. They're struggling to have enough money to borrow, or have enough money to buy grain so they can eat, They don't have enough money to pay the king's tax. So what they're forced to do is borrow money. And they borrow money from fellow Israelites, and these Israelites give them loans with high interest rates, which is completely against the Torah. And then they end up selling their land to fellow Israelites. And then they end up selling their sons and their daughters into slavery. So this is a horrible stain. This doesn't look good at all. Nehemiah tries to fix it, but it's really kind of an ugly situation. And the point of Nehemiah chapter 5 is that it doesn't belong. It really doesn't fit with this exciting, upbeat narrative that's unfolding here in Nehemiah 1-7. And what's more, Nehemiah 5 is placed as a deliberate interruption into a very tight symmetry in Nehemiah 1-7. So Nehemiah 1-7 is designed as this giant chiasm where the outside matches and then it matches in here. But Nehemiah 5 is going to totally just run in there and break everything. And it's going to be located right around here. So that's Nehemiah chapter 5 for you. Let me say chapter 5. Now let's take a look at this tight symmetry and how Nehemiah 5 is going to interrupt that. Nehemiah chapter 5. So here is Nehemiah 1-7. And like I told you, it is just this tight, beautiful symmetry where everything has its parallel except chapter 5, which just runs in there and deliberately draws attention to itself. So why does it do that? What's the point? Well, Jason DeRoshi, again, is going to say that chapter 5 and other places in this book is going to demonstrate that while God may have taken his people out of Babylon, he hasn't taken Babylon out of his people. That still needs to happen. So each of these anticlimaxes in this first section is going to anticipate the book's devastating ending, and it's going to prepare us to wrestle with the book's enduring message, which is that here at the end of Israel's history, the promised kingdom has not yet come, and the people are still waiting.